What up, what up? Welcome back. I didn't think I'd be making a video this soon after the last video, but there looks to be some interesting things going on in the markets, and I'm not going to get panicky. I'm not going to get people riled up, but there are definitely some eye-opening developments taking place. I'm sure you guys are probably aware of it by now, whether you're looking at the British pound, whether you're looking at the Chinese yuan, the Japanese yen, or the bonds here in the United States or elsewhere. I mean, there are so many different things that are seemingly blowing up in this market, and it's getting very interesting. And I want to kind of put this into a context that is sensible for Monero Bros, because I think there is going to be policy changes as a result of this. And I really don't know what the outcome is going to be in regards to all this, because there are some people who are running for the hills right now. Then there are some people who are saying this isn't too much of a problem. They're trying to taper inflation. Maybe they're going to have to pivot sooner than they thought. But, at least things are going to be a little bit more normalized in regards to the rates. There are a lot of different takes on this, and the fact that the Fed hasn't come out to say anything yet kind of indicates that nobody really knows what's going on. Nobody really knows what's going on. I don't know what's going on for the most part. Usually, if we get to points like this, there is a policy change, or somebody at least goes out there to say, hey, we're keeping track of the situation. Maybe we're going to change our policy. We're going to be data dependent, whatever. The Fed usually at least says something that tapers down the market and relaxes people. But I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing hawkishness. I'm seeing Fed officials continue to say we're going to be raising those rates regardless of what happens, because inflation's getting out of control. We need to taper it down. But there's an interesting dynamic taking place where, particularly in Europe, you have a lot of these policies, these domestic policies, that is going to make inflation worse, whether it's shutting down nuclear power plants, shutting down natural gas operations, cutting taxes, as they're doing in the UK. They're doing a lot of these domestic policies, which is going to make inflation worse in the United States. There's the discussion of canceling student debt, which apparently, according to data now, is going to cost about $400 billion over the next 10 or 30 years. I forgot how many years. But that's going to make inflation increase too, because if people aren't, paying their debts, then they're going to be using that money to then buy other things in the market, and that's going to drive up prices even more. That's just what happens when you forgive debts. People have more disposable income that isn't going towards debt payments, which means it's going to go towards other things, probably consumer goods and stuff. But, there are a lot of policies which is making inflation worse, but the central banks are trying to taper inflation by raising interest rates. But if you raise interest rates, then that makes borrowing more expensive. And the presumption is, if you make borrowing more expensive, you make credit more expensive, that means there's less money moving through the system. Okay, but that crushes the average person out there, because they're going to need credit in order to keep up with the lifestyle that they're living. And most Americans, according to data, don't have really many savings left. Their credit cards are tapped out, from what I can tell. And now they're being hit by higher borrowing costs at the same time. So it's getting interesting out there. And I think that if the Fed has to pivot soon, my main point that I want to make is there are going to be price controls. And Biden came out today, and he was talking about how gas stations need to lower the price of gas, right? Now, I don't know if there's going to be some kind of order to encourage them to do that or force them to do that. But we're already starting to see politicians go out there and talk about controlling prices or shift blame to people who are selling certain goods in order to encourage them to lower prices or whatever. So as the buffers thin more, you're going to have more blame shifting. You're going to have more of a desire for these politicians to try to just hit these whack-a-moles to keep everything in check, keep everything down. And I think price controls is going to be one of those things. And as we've talked about here on the channel, price controls, when you have price controls, that leads to shortages, because there's going to be more of a demand for goods, um, and the price signals are messed up, right? Like, people go to buy goods, and if you have a shortage of goods, which is what's happening because of the supply chain, because of what's going on in Europe with the energy crisis, if you have a shortage of goods, then that means the price of those goods have to go up, because if demand stays the same, then you run out of goods, right? And that's what's going to happen if you have price controls, which means you're going to lead into a scenario where rationing is then going to be considered. And if you have rationing, then that means you're going to have black markets pop up, because people are going to want more than the rationed amount. And we've always said that this is something which is going to be very bullish for Monero, because you're going to need a black market currency. And as rationing picks up, you're going to have a desire on the behalf of these politicians in order to try to prevent money and goods leaking out of their system. And I think the CBDC is going to play into this. I think that the whole cashless society theme that we're seeing is going to play into this. We're seeing in the UK, we're seeing in Israel, how there are increasing regulations being passed, which make it so that people can't hold a certain amount of cash. People can't transact a certain amount of cash. That's going to play into cryptocurrency. They're going to make regulations, which is going to make it more difficult for you to take your crypto off of exchanges. And self-ownership, self-hosted wallets are going to be cracked down as well. We've already seen that a little bit in Europe, and that's going to be the trend that this goes. And that's going to be the way that this goes. So it is a little bit late, and I do want to make this somewhat quick, because I didn't really plan on doing a video. It's kind of during the week, but I have to just get this out there. So first off, I want to thank Thanos.xmr. Thank you for this post that you made. You were talking about shipping in for me to get a Linux laptop, and I appreciate the sentiment. My buddy Andrew is helping me out get up with Linux, and he's recommending Manjaro, and he says that he can put it on like a flash drive to put it in my computer, and then I should be able to at that point do just a simple series of steps and then download it. But we'll see what happens with that. But one thing that's really impressive, guys, is Monero's fortitude in the middle of all this, because Monero is up about or it was about 6%. I guess it is still 6% on the day in dollar terms, and it's up 1.25% against Bitcoin. Now, I never talk about charts. I never talk about the price action of Monero, but with everything going on in the market right now, with the volatility, with the bonds crashing, with the stocks crashing, with even gold and silver taking big hits, it's impressive that cryptocurrency is kind of being able to hold up the way that it has, and in particular Monero. Now, I don't know if this is part of a fear trade, which is playing in here. People are seeing how, if there is an inflation problem, which the Fed can't properly control, maybe that's going to lead to the kind of scenarios that I was just discussing. It's most certainly going to encourage politicians to raise taxes, because you're going to have to get revenues into the coffers somehow, because if they don't get those revenues through taxes, then that means they're going to have to get that revenue through the Fed, quote-unquote revenue. I mean, they're going to have the Fed buy the bonds, or the central banks, which means more inflation, which means those bonds become ever weaker in price, because those bonds are denominated in that inflated currency, right? And so I think a lot of people are putting these things together, because higher taxes, and who knows, maybe unrealized capital gains tax, which have already been floated, that makes people nervous about having their money on the system. People are going to be incentivized to take their money off the system, and then price controls, as we talked about, that's going to encourage black market activity, which Monero is the black market currency du jour, basically. So these are just a couple things I'm thinking about right now, just off the top of my head. But it is, frankly, somewhat mind-blowing to me that Monero is at $2.5 billion in market cap. I mean, it's just insane. And I think it's going way higher than that. But even if it doesn't, guys, just note, the use case of Monero is growing. You're going to get more value out of having Monero in this future that we're moving into. And I want to talk more about that in this video. But yeah, it's definitely pretty interesting. So why is the pound tanking like it is? Some people are saying it's trading like Luna. And then bonds are also selling off significantly. I think I read that the UK bonds are down like 37 to 40% this year, which is really, really significant. I think the pound just hit an all-time low against the dollar, which is, of course, significant. So one of the things that enticed this move was the proposition of massive tax cuts, which means less money going into the government, which means the Bank of England has to make up for that slack. Because if there's anything governments won't do, it's cut spending. So they're going to have to get that money from somewhere, which means they're going to have to probably print it, which means the value of the currency has to go lower, which I think is what the market kind of picked up from that. So, yeah, just really crazy stuff going on there. The announcement featured a volume of tax cuts not seen in Britain since 1972 and a return to the trickle-down economics, quote-unquote, promoted by the likes of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. So an erosion of confidence, that's not good. Basically, the whole thing is a con game. So pretty interesting. Pretty interesting. They're talking about how it's a textbook currency crisis. And the UK, they don't have many reserves to back this stuff up. I mean, the yen is definitely having a crisis right now. And I think it's not going to get better if the dollar doesn't tank soon, because it's the strong dollar that's causing a lot of these currencies to go into a tailspin, because a lot of people, they want to buy U.S. treasuries instead of the bonds in these that are denominated in these other currencies, right? Like you would want to buy a 2-year treasury at 4% rather than a 10-year Japanese bond at 0.25%, which is basically what it's at now. And so that means the demand for those bonds are going down, which means those central banks have to continue to buy those bonds with inflated money. And so the value of their currencies then are having to take a big hit. And so how do you get how do you buy those currencies, right? Well, for Japan, they've got about $1.2 trillion in dollar-denominated bonds. And so what they're doing is they're selling those bonds in order to get dollars, in order to then go into the market and then buy their yen with those dollars. Okay, but here's the deal. When they sell those bonds, that makes the yield on U.S. Treasuries go up, right? Because they have to attract more investors. They have to attract demand for those bonds, which are being sold, which means those bonds actually become more attractive. Okay, and so then the value of the dollar then goes up in response to that. And so it turns into like this doom loop type thing, where it's sort of like a self-feedback loop. And so some people are thinking like there's going to be a Plaza Accord as a result of this, where there's just an agreement to devalue the dollar in order to try to kind of turn a lot of this stuff back. And then there's the idea that the Federal Reserve just completely pivots and just goes back to cutting. But the problem with that is they barely touched inflation. Inflation's still getting worse. And so they would have to completely admit defeat at that point. And then you lose a lot of confidence there. And who knows if the loss of confidence is significant enough to pretty much just take down the whole system. So that's sort of like a lot of the complexity that's playing into this. But Jens Nordvig, he has a chart showing the UK bonds. I mean, this is pretty crazy, right? Look at that move. It's just going vertical, the interest rate, and the value is just going down proportionally. So it's really quite something. And then also interesting to note about the UK is they've sold a lot of their gold, similar to Canada. Canada, I don't think, has any gold left. Now, they have a lot of gold mines, which is good, but they've sold a lot of the gold that's in their vaults. And the UK seems to have done the same thing ever since 2013. Look at this chart. This is from Luke Groman. Yeah, just look at those outflows. And a lot of that gold's going to China, Russia, and Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Poland. So really interesting. You see a lot of gold moving east. And then Alf, he says the UK holds less than $100 billion in net FX reserves. That's roughly 3% of GDP. Japan, 20% of GDP they have in reserves. Switzerland, about 115% of GDP. So the UK holds less than $100 billion in FX reserves. Now, Japan, to, if I remember right, defend the yuan back in, I believe, 1997 when they did their last intervention into the FX market during the Asian tiger crisis. Well, they needed to spend $171 billion in order to defend the currency. Now, it's probably going to be much more for them this time around, which means they're going to have to sell a lot more U.S. Treasuries. They're going to have to, buy their currency a lot with it. But, it's that's not a lot. $100 billion in FX reserves. That is not a lot at all to defend their currency with. So they better hope something turns around. I mean, definitely, I think they're going to go back on the tax cut proposal, but who knows what's going to happen. Breaking, the British pound is now pegged to Luna. LOL, kind of funny. And let's go on to Europe to sort of analyze what's going on there, which is going to cause inflation, which is going to work against the ECB and what they're trying to do, which is tape inflation. So we are in the middle of an energy crisis. This is from Peter Sweden. I really like his takes. He's really got his finger on the pulse. He says, tonight, Belgium is shutting down a nuclear plant that has provided 10% of the country's electricity. So this is a trend that we've actually seen for the last year and a half. They're just shutting down nuclear power plants everywhere in Europe. Pretty crazy. I mean, especially given that they lost half their natural gas imports from Russia. And, the United States, we want to lower our gas prices too, so it's questionable how much we're going to be able to export to them. A lot of countries around the world are going into kind of like a protectionist type of stance, wanting to preserve a lot of their domestically produced raw materials and resources. And so it's just crazy that they're shutting down a lot of their own energy capacity. And it's not just nuclear power. As Peter Sweden notes over here, he says, did you know Europe has one of the world's largest natural gas fields? The Netherlands just announced they would massively reduce output from it despite we are in the middle of an energy crisis. So it's just crazy what's going on over there. I mean, I thought about this the other day. Like, if you take your average Joe off the street, he has a little bit of common sense, maybe IQ of about 110 or so. You put him in charge, make him the dictator of one of these countries, these problems could be fixed rather quickly. These aren't hard problems to solve. Okay, you need energy, you go in the ground, you get it. You set up nuclear power plants. Now, nuclear power plants with the regs, they take quite a long time. If I remember this article correctly, there's a nuclear power plant here in America that took about 25 years to get built and set up. Now, you cut a lot of that red tape. You just do what you need to do to open these things back up. And it's not like you can just close these things, open them back up the next day. It's obviously like a process. But these problems are self-inflicted in most cases. And it's no brainer what's causing a lot of the suffering that is coming about in Europe. I mean, it's a lack of energy. And so, they're not going to make alliances with Russia. That's completely off the table now, apparently. They're not going to produce more energy. They're not going to work with other nations to try to resolve these issues. They're just going to double down and double down and double down, it seems, until, I guess the entire European zone is just populated with the likes of the people who were just elected in Italy. And I have no comment on that. I think it's an interesting development. I'm kind of in this wait and see kind of stance. I know people get really hype every time somebody who they believe is going to make great change gets elected, but I think we've seen enough of those instances where it's sort of like it's reasonable to just wait and see. I mean, it's good that the European people, or I guess the Italian people in particular, have some survival instinct, I guess you could say, but just maybe I'm a little bit jaded by modern politics. I don't know. We'll see. Let me know what you guys think. I'm curious. But I do like what this new Italian prime minister has to say, or premier. I forgot what role she's playing. But, I mean, we've seen Matteo Salvini. We've seen Nigel Farage. People thought Boris Johnson was going to be the guy. People thought Trump was going to be the guy. And almost nothing changed, right? So we'll see. But European nations are already in conflict. This is from Michael Schallenberger. He says Netherlands refuses to produce more natural gas. Belgium and Germany closing nuclear power plants. France opposes new gas pipelines to Spain. Hungary says sanctions on Russia backfired. So, U.S. and Canada won't help. Yeah, because we have our own issues. Joe Biden is just totally pillaging the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is now down to 1984 levels. So we're literally just running out of the stock that we have, the emergency stock. And yeah, it's getting interesting. It's getting interesting. And then we still have these types of things going on, which has been going on for a while. We've noted a little bit, but Ice Age Farmer has been doing a great job sort of tracking all these events. But Peter Sweden here, he comments, he says, remember summer when so many food plants were destroyed in fires? Now there's been a fire at the world's biggest produce market located in France. What's going on? We've seen trail derailments. We've seen ammonium manufacturing plants shut down. Ammonium is or ammonia rather, is an essential ingredient in the production of fertilizers, which is important for food. So we're just seeing the food supply chain really start to break down. That's going to play into inflation again, which is fighting against the banks, the central banks who are trying to taper inflation by increasing interest rates and by doing quantitative tightening and things like this, right? So you're going to have stagflation like you can't believe. And so that's going to lead to price controls, which is going to lead to what we talked about earlier. So the Chinese market's cheapened. Let's go to China. But it's been cheap for a year and for good reason. The yuan is an anchor of asset prices, but it's losing its grip. Yeah, so it's tied pretty close with commodities, if I understand properly. So with the yuan devaluing, that's going to have implications for commodities, which is going to have implications for a lot of jobs, a lot of miners, a lot of producers in emerging markets, and perhaps even here in the States. So there's that. China state banks ordered to buy stocks. This is from Zero Hedge. This tweet, by the way, was from Hao Hong. I just want to make sure I quote properly. Zero Hedge, China state banks ordered to buy stocks to contain selling coming to every central bank near you. Now, you guys remember how in March 2020, they discussed and then in a particular way implemented corporate bond buying. They started to buy corporate bond ETFs, the Federal Reserve. Now, Europe was already there at the ECB. They've been buying corporate bonds forever. Japan's been doing the same thing forever, too. Now you have the Chinese buying stocks, which seems rather novel to me, even though I think behind the surface, the PBOC has been doing a lot of buying in the markets for a while. I mean, because it's a communist country, pretty much anything goes to keep everything stable. But, and who knows? I think some people think the Federal Reserve is buying stocks and bonds kind of on a whim here in the United States too at the New York trading desk. But I don't know. It's an interesting conversation. But yeah, now they're buying stocks. I think central banks are probably going to do that in other parts of the world because they need more collateral to monetize, right? They have to get more money into the system, especially with everything going on right now. This from Jason Burak. He's from Wall Street from Main Street. Go check his channel out. He's got a lot of great content. But he says the premiums will probably not come down. They are up to $50 an ounce in China right now. He's talking about gold premiums. And there is a little bit of a disconnect from what I'm noticing between the prices which are on the COMEX and the LBMA here in the West and the prices that you're seeing on the Shanghai Exchange over in China. There is a discrepancy of about 2 to 3%, which is interesting because that presents an arbitrage opportunity for people to take gold from the West and then sell it over in the East for a premium. And so if you have that continuing to happen, and Russia and China own a lot of the stocks of gold and silver, as we talked about before, because the UK, Canada, and who knows how much gold is left in Fort Knox here in the United States, they've exported a lot of their gold over East, then there's going to be that much more of an incentive for China and Russia to adjust the price of gold and silver so that they can increase their own FX reserve positions. So that's interesting. That's interesting. There's been a lot of speculation, and I think, honestly, proof that the COMEX and the LBMA have been manipulating the gold price down because they know that gold and silver are inflation barometers. They measure inflation. So if gold and silver start to move, then that means inflation is higher than what the CPI is saying. And so it's just another part of the program to try to manipulate people into thinking that inflation is lower than it actually is. It keeps bond prices relatively high, right? It keeps the interest rates relatively low because interest rates are also a barometer of inflation. So who knows? Maybe this is starting to shift things, right? So that's just another thing to kind of keep an eye out for. Jason Burek, he also says emerging markets are being crushed by stagflation and their domestic currencies falling against the dollar. Many of these countries have also drained a lot of their foreign exchange reserves trying to prop up their currencies. Falling commodity prices also means job losses too, as I noted before. And also to note, one of the reasons the dollar is going up a lot is because a lot of people around the world and a lot of nations have dollar-denominated debt. I mean, do you guys remember when we talked about Evergrande last year, how they had about $300 billion in U.S. dollar-denominated debt? So they need dollars in order to pay that debt. And if dollars get more expensive, and there's the anticipation of dollars becoming more expensive, then that means that people have to get into the market to buy those dollars with their currency, which weakens their currency, which strengthens the dollar. And that makes the dollar that much more expensive, and again, kind of plays into that loop we talked about earlier. Tracy Schigel, I think her name is Schuchart or something like that. U.S. dollar strength is merely exporting inflation to quell domestic inflation. I have to think at some point Yellen Powell decides not to blow up the global economy. So yeah, dollars get, yeah, you guys understand what that means. I don't have to spell that for you. But yeah, dollar strengthens. Imports become cheaper for American citizens. That keeps inflation at least relatively low here in the States. And that makes everything more expensive for just about everybody else. Food, energy, etc., especially given the petrodollar is still a thing. So something to note, this is about the $400 billion student loan forgiveness plan. We'll see if that goes through, but yeah, that'll cause inflation. That's talking about the SPR. We discussed that. People are saying it's a national security risk. I don't think they care. But because of all these things, and yeah, Wall Street Silver, go follow him, good takes. If the Fed takes rates of 4.75%, we could see 30-year mortgage rates of 8%. They peaked at 6.5% in August 2008, just before Lehman collapsed, and 8% would not even be extreme in a historic perspective, especially considering that inflation matches the 1970s. Who can afford this? Right. And Jeffrey Gunlock, he says the national average 30-year mortgage rate is sprinting towards 7%, thanks to 40% median home price increases over the last 2 years. And the massive increase in mortgage interest rates, the monthly payment on the median-priced U.S. home is already up about 100% versus 2 years ago. So, yeah, that's going to cause rents to skyrocket because people can't afford to lock into these arrangements. So they're just going to rent and hope that prices go down at some point. And so what's this all going to lead to? It's going to lead to the Fed probably pivoting in order to stop everything from blowing up. And that means that they're going to have to take another strategy, the government anyway, which means price controls. I think that's what that means. I'm pretty confident about it. So let's talk about more Monero news now that we've sort of made that case. This is from Zero Hedge. We've been sort of tracking our buddy Zero Hedge here a little bit. He's becoming an avid Monero bro, which is pretty encouraging, but he says another one of our partners has just been kicked off multiple platforms, PayPal, Venmo, and Google. This is something we're seeing more of course, and he says you never know in your powers that be will the platform you for thinking for yourself. And he says, hashtag Monero, unbank yourself. So he's pretty hyped about Monero. I think we're going to start to see more articles about Monero and Zero Hedge, and I think that's going to be pretty key because, as we're going to get to, a lot of the big Bitcoin contrarians, they have pretty positive things to say about Monero, at least according to this Wayback Machine picture here, where we have Mike Maloney talking about how the internet money that Milton Friedman was predicting a number of years ago sounds more like Monero rather than Bitcoin, because he understands Bitcoin isn't fungible. And I think he understands that Monero is, because it's private on the base layer. Pretty smart guy. I think he understands. And I think a lot of the gold and silver people do too. And we're starting to see, I think, more adoption of Monero at online gold and silver retailers. I think that's going to continue. because gold people are smart. They understand how money works. I think if you tell them about Monero, I think they'll get it. But unfortunately, a lot of the crypto space is tainted by what people see in the Bitcoin realm. A lot of the craziness with Michael Saylor and other people of his ilk, right, just puts a bad shine, a bad tint on the crypto space. And so a lot of people just don't get the opportunity to learn about Monero, unfortunately. And I think in the Monero community, you got a lot of really smart and sensible people who, in many cases, tell you to get a stack of gold and silver first before you get some Monero. Because, if this energy thing really kicks up, are you going to have the energy to even afford to use Monero or cryptocurrency or to even flick your lights on? So who knows? Just something to consider. Monero is the only cryptocurrency, according to Zero Hedge, that is fully autonomous. Fully encrypted, completely private, untraceable, and cannot be sanctioned by any government, including the U.S., Russia, China, Korea. Yeah. And mind you, this is just a writer for Zero Hedge. This isn't Zero Hedge the page. He's just a contributor. But he says nobody can ever know how much money you have or spend. Monero is true internet money. And now he's a Cake Wallet bro. Pretty cool. Cake Wallet used to be a sponsored channel. What's up, Cake Wallet? So, ZR1 Trader, he follows me, so he gets some of the takes coming through his feed, I think. He says, welcome to CipherTrace's advanced tracking capabilities. Now institutions can pay $16K to analyze with 1/16th probability that I've sent Monero to you. Monero just got a security upgrade too, increasing risk signatures to 16, by the way. Still most used on the dark net. Transactions hit all-time highs. And the main Zero Hedge page follows ZR1 Trader. So Zero Hedge, whoever's behind Zero Hedge is learning more about this. A lot of big names are learning more about this. We've seen hedge fund bros wake up to this as well. So adoption is occurring slowly but surely. It's only a matter of time. And this is something that I saw, which kind of interested me. This is from Peter Thiel. Now, Peter Thiel, he's an interesting character. Some people are sort of split on him. Some people think he's a globalista. Some people think he is sort of like one of these Elon Musk types. He got really rich, and now he's trying to use his wealth and his influence and his credibility, I guess, to advocate for kind of libertarian ideals and for smaller government and things like this. I think he's a smart guy. I don't know what to make of him in that regard, but this is what he says about the probable future we could be facing. So this is interesting.
You think that the future that China represents is not a future that is particularly desirable? I was struck by this when I was in Western Europe a few months ago. That I think the future is something that always has to be thought of in relatively concrete terms, and it has to be different from the present. And only something that's different from the present and very concrete can have any sort of charismatic force. And looking at Western Europe, I would say there are basically three plausible futures on offer. Number one is Islamic Sharia law, and if you're a woman, you get to wear a burqa. Number two is totalitarian AI a la China, where the computers track you in everything you do all the time, and that's kind of creepy, sort of the Eye of Sauron, to use the Lord of the Rings reference, right, watching you at all times. And then the third one is hyper-environmentalism, where you drive an e-scooter and you recycle. And even though I'm not a radical environmentalist, I think if those are the three choices, you can understand why the green movement's winning.
Well, I think it's going to be a mix of the three, at least in Western Europe for a little bit. I think probably the Islamic Sharia law, if it comes into sort of like a conflict with the other two tangible futures, as he says, I think the Islamic Sharia law would probably win out, if you want to know the truth, because they have the most powerful, I guess, baseline energetic force behind them, right? I mean, they have religion. And the Chinese totalitarian AI, they don't really have that. They just have technology. The hyper-environmentalists, that's an interesting thing. There is sort of a religious element to that too, because people love Gaia, people love the planet, and people want to save the planet. And it's weird. They think of the planet as like a hyper-intelligent, multi-million year living organism, like a super organism, but they think it was just too stupid to stop humans from doing what they ended up doing. What that is, we don't really quite know yet, because, well, let's not get into all that. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting thing. And I sort of thought about this for a little bit. And under Islamic Sharia law, historically, if you don't convert, you pay the higher jizya tax. And the jizya tax is basically a tax that you pay if you're not a Muslim living in an Islamic nation. It's what the Christians historically had to pay if they lived in the Middle East somewhere. And so if that's the case, you're not going to want your money on a public blockchain because they're going to see how much you have and then they're going to get it. They're going to tax it. That's something to note there. And then scenario 2, all transactions monitored, taxed. And when I say you're not going to want to, I'm saying a lot of people won't want to, encouraging anything. Anyways, all transactions monitored. We're talking about the Chinese totalitarian AI scenario, all transactions monitored, taxed, and judged in accordance with social credit. And if there's enough adoption of these public blockchain cryptocurrencies, I anticipate that, if it's not CBDC and if it's Bitcoin or Ethereum instead, then you as a business are going to have to register your address probably with the government. And then you're going to have that tied with your EIN, your tax identification number, and that's going to make it easier for your accountant, by the way, in order to figure out what transactions you've been doing so that you can figure out what's deductible and what's not. And everything is just going to be tracked from there, because if your wallet gets in contact with one of these wallets which are on the grid, then add that to metadata, they'll figure out who you are, and your capacity to stay private is going to be heavily diminished. And by then, surely, just like with Tornado Cash, a lot of these mixing solutions are going to be banned. Or if you get crypto which was in contact with those mixing services, which they can easily determine now, well then you're going to have tainted crap. You're not going to be able to use it at all. Maybe they come knock at your door. So who knows? Something to consider. Doesn't sound very good. And then scenario 3 with the hyper-environmentalism, proof of work mining, either heavily regulated or banned. Something we're already seeing because it just produces too much carbon. It's just too energy intensive. And we all really know the agenda behind it. They want to encourage people to switch to proof of stake cryptos, really because it's just more centralized. It's more easy to co-op because you don't need to figure out random math problems. You just need to get the most stake, and it just turns into a classical system of equity ownership of sorts. So high inflation, carbon measuring of transactions, and surveillance. So we're already seeing like carbon cards come out. Your purchases are going to be limited based on what goods and services you're consuming, and that plays into kind of what we talked about before, where all your transactions are still going to be on the system if you use these other cryptocurrencies, which, while they may not be able to be printed out of thin air like you can with the CBDC or with the classical fiat currency, you're still going to have your transactions tracked and taxed, and who knows, maybe you have a knack on your social credit score mixing in with scenario 2 or some other consequence if you go over your allotted carbon amount. So Monero just seems like an obvious play in all those 3 things. I had an interesting fella comment on this. Let me know what you guys think. He says, just hedging against bad outcomes is for losers. So I guess we're losers because I'm encouraging like the average normal person to use something which allows them to transact outside of like a total totalitarian, dystopian, like Mark of the Beast type system. We need to offer a positive alternative vision. Well, I think going to church and living a life in Christ is a good positive vision. He says this is a doomer world view. Now, I don't think he watches our channel, to be fair, but I would encourage him to, because we're typically pretty positive. Just tonight, I'm just going through the news, not many jokes, just because it is late and I have work tomorrow and I had to get this video out. But yeah, usually we're in good spirits. I always tell you guys not to worry. I always tell you guys to relax. we're in the right positions, and if anything, everything is done for our salvation. All the hardships we're going to go through, it's for the strengthening of our spirits and to bring us closer to Christ. And that's always been my message. So even though we always have sober takes on what's going on in reality, we're not just, there is a term called satanic optimism. You can be satanically optimistic to where it's just like everything that you see is bad, but like it's, you delude yourself into thinking like somehow it's, that's not the right way to put it, because the way I like to think of these things is there are bad things going on, but through Christ and through a positive perspective, we can transfigure these bad things into something which is good. And I've seen that in my own life. I see that in the lives of many other people. You can see that in the lives of the saints. It is something which happens. So something which is bad, it can be transfigured into something good. But that's totally different from being just a delusional Pollyanna. You know what I mean? There is a nuanced difference between those two. And I always try to offer a white pill, but regardless, he says, in reality, this is his positive vision. He says, in reality, there will be a bunch of international crypto chads that work remotely and make bank. After all the normies got wrecked, they will take over the levers of society. Everything is fine. So in his positive worldview, the normies get wrecked. And the crypto chads, the internationalist crypto bros will take over, and then everything will be fine. Let me know what you guys think of that. Is that a positive view to you? Like everyone just getting wrecked, except for like a few select, crypto jet setters like Michael Saylor, who then take over society and just turn everything into like a Gnostic, nihilistic, maybe not Chinese totalitarian AI, but still a technocratic system. I mean, because the crypto bros, they kind of play into the same paradigm as the technocrats. They believe technology can solve all problems. And there's nothing really beyond that needs to be considered. It's just like we need to adopt the right technology. Monero is the right technology. And if we adopt Monero, then everything will be fine because, it's a trustless system, whatever. But we all know that's kind of an elementary way to look at things, right? It's obviously a deeper issue than that. But is that all I want to get to? Oh, yeah. So we're vindicated on this, by the way. We told you that the IRS will be coming up to the crypto bros with the 87,000 new agents, and that's what they're doing. So CNBC reports IRS steps up efforts to target U.S. taxpayers who failed to report and pay tax on cryptocurrency transactions. It's coming. It's happening. But that's no surprise to you if you watch this channel. I told you about that forever. Zano. Monero is mentioned in a new Netflix Norwegian TV show. There's a ransom, and they're demanding Monero. So look at this. This is pretty cool. Monero. And it's talking about sort of like what Monero is, and I guess some criminal bros in this TV show are requesting it. So that's kind of cool, getting some exposure. There's some people upset by this because they're like, oh, the first introduction people get to Monero is like it's criminal cryptocurrency or whatever. But who cares? They learned that it's a private cryptocurrency, and if they're smart, they'll do 1 + 1, and they'll realize, maybe I don't want my transactions being tracked either. So I don't see it as a bad thing. As a lot of people in politics say, bad news is good news. Any news is good news, right? So pretty cool, bro. But I think that's it. I just wanted to sort of rush through this. How long was this video? 45 minutes. So even a short video, I can get out in under 45 minutes. But I hope that you guys got something from this. Hope that you guys, kind of understand where the super hyper mega can't even talk tonight. Super hyper mega bullish case is going. We're just continuing to see things happen. And although the way it's happening is not exactly the way that we thought it was going to happen, it's still happening nevertheless. It's sort of one of those things where it's like we know the destination, we know where the road is going, but we don't know what the weather is going to be like as we make the journey, right? So it's sort of one of those things. A lot of the stuff is catching me off guard. I'm surprised the dollar is getting as strong relative to the other currencies that it is. And don't be misguided, guys. Inflation is still taking off. Just because the dollar is strengthening relative to other currencies doesn't mean the dollar is strengthening in absolute terms against commodities and against gold and against all these other things in the real sense. A lot of this stuff is just market hocus pocus. It's not real. But, yeah, you guys are a smart audience. I'm sure you get all that stuff. But that's all I really have to say thank you guys for the continued donations. I see a lot of the donations coming in. I appreciate it. And if you guys want me to say something on video for the next video, I always do those private super chats. So hit me up in the Proton Mail if you got a message you want me to send to the Monero Bros out there. And yeah, that's about it. Good night to everybody. Take care. God bless. See you next time.